Mansa Musa was the emperor of Mali in the 14th century. He went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and that journey, that single trip, crashed the value of gold across continents. It triggered an economic crisis, one that lasted for more than a decade. This was a man whose faith and fortune bent the entire financial system of the medieval world. He had almost unimaginable wealth. We need to look at the true source of that wealth, and we need to trace the path of his caravan. It was like a moving city. It carried tons of gold directly into the heart of the global market. So how did a ruler from West Africa become the central character in this story? A story of devotion, diplomacy, and unintended chaos. The Sahel, that stretch of land along the Sahara's southern edge, that was his world, a dry, sun-baked region but far from empty. It was the center of the Mali Empire. Under Mansa Musa, that empire reached from the Atlantic coast far into the interior, a place of cities, Timbuktu, Gao. They weren't just markets, they were centers of learning, universities, libraries, drawing scholars from across Africa and the Middle East, but the real power was underground. Mali held the gold fields, Bambuk and Bure. These weren't just simple mines, they were sophisticated operations, producing the purest gold anyone knew. For centuries, that gold moved north, in caravans across the desert, a steady trickle, feeding economies in North Africa and further out. Mansa Musa didn't just control the trickle, though. He controlled the source. The wealth was systemic, built on a whole structure, a bureaucracy that managed trade, collected taxes, maintained a large army. This was a state that could organize resources on a continental scale. So when this emperor, this steward of the world's primary gold supply, decided to go on a pilgrimage, it was never going to be quiet. The stage was set by his faith, yes, but also by the sheer, concentrated weight of the treasure he commanded, his journey. That was the moment the trickle became a flood. He was Mansa Musa, Emperor Moses. That faith was right there in his name, in how he ruled. He took power in 1312 after something strange happened. The ruler before him, Mansa Abubakari II, he took a huge fleet of ships. He sailed them into the Atlantic, trying to find what was out there. And he never came back. That disappearance put Musa on the throne, and he became one of the most remarkable leaders we know of. His empire had many beliefs. Islam was there, and traditional spiritual systems. Mansa Musa himself was a devout Muslim, but his rule showed a real tolerance, a focus on justice. The stories from then describe him listening to his people, settling disputes fairly, keeping a long peace inside the empire. That stability was the foundation. It was the bedrock, and he used the wealth from the gold fields, not just for himself but as a tool to build something that would last. He transformed cities. Timbuktu, Gao, he made them centers of learning. He funded universities, libraries, mosques, drawing the greatest minds of the age. His vision was to put Mali on the map. The intellectual map, the spiritual map of the world. So his decision to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, it was never just personal. It was an act of statecraft. For him, faith and diplomacy were connected. They were two sides of the same coin. This pilgrimage was his chance to announce Mali's grandeur to the Islamic world. To show its sophistication, its power, he wanted to show it wasn't a myth, not just a distant land of gold, but a real civilization, organized, formidable. He was a pious pilgrim fulfilling his duty, and he was a shrewd statesman, launching the most ambitious public relations mission of his time. To understand what his journey did, you have to see him as both. The flood of gold that followed wasn't an accident, it was the plan, a deliberate strategy from an emperor who understood spectacle. The Hajj was a duty. A pillar of his faith, for any Muslim with the means, with the health, it was a requirement, a lifelong spiritual requirement, and Mansa Musa was the emperor of the wealthiest state on earth. So for him, it was also an opportunity to turn a private act of devotion into a public declaration, to walk that path not just as a believer but as a sovereign. And that created a unique mandate. The spiritual imperative gave him the justification, the reason to mobilize resources on a scale no one had ever seen. This wasn't just a trip, he was moving a piece of his empire across a continent. The route was a test of endurance. From the heart of Mali, the caravan would head north. Into the Sahara, that vast, empty sea of sand and rock, scorching days, freezing nights, where water was more precious than the gold they carried, they would cross that desert. A journey of months to reach the Nile in Egypt, then turn east following the river north before finally crossing into the Arabian Peninsula. The entire round trip could take well over a year. And every step of that journey, from the Sahara's dunes to the streets of Cairo, would become a stage. His faith required him to go. His position demanded he go as an emperor. So he prepared a caravan that was, in every sense, a traveling capital, a mobile display of Mali's power and piety, the divine mandate made manifest. A spiritual journey wrapped in the cloak of imperial spectacle. That caravan was a logistical masterpiece, a feat of planning that would challenge any modern state. To move 60,000 people across a continent, you need more than camels and gold. You need an entire support system, the food alone. For a journey lasting a year or more, they needed tons of grain. Dried meat, dates, they needed water, carried in massive leather skins, enough for the Sahara's most brutal stretches. They needed tents for shelter. Tools for repairs, medicines for illness. This was a mobile city, and like any city, it required a government. Among those 60,000 were soldiers, servants, but also administrators, judges, diplomats. They were there to keep order, to negotiate with local rulers, to manage the day-to-day affairs of this traveling population. The 12,000 individuals in the royal entourage weren't just attendants. They were a curated display, musicians, poets, scholars, skilled artisans, all traveling with Mansa Musa, turning his camp into a living exhibition of Malian culture wherever it stopped. The 80 to 100 camels, each with 300 pounds of gold, that was the official treasury. Countless more animals carried trade goods, gifts for foreign leaders, the personal wealth of merchants and nobles who joined for protection and opportunity. Every element was calculated, the placement of the guards, the distribution of supplies. This wasn't a chaotic migration, it was a sovereign procession, moving with deliberate, awe-inspiring slowness. Its purpose was to be seen, to be talked about, to reshape the idea of West Africa for everyone who witnessed it. The gold was the headline, but the true power was the organization behind it, the impeccable, overwhelming organization. Cairo in the summer of 1324 was the busiest city in the Mediterranean. A crossroads under the Mamluk sultans, its markets were full of goods from 3 continents. Its streets were a constant press of people, but nothing prepared the city for what came from the south. A dust cloud on the horizon, growing larger, then the first glimpse of the procession, thousands of travelers, a river of people and animals that seemed endless. And at its center, a figure on a magnificent litter. Mansa Musa had arrived. His entry was diplomatic theater. Before meeting the Sultan, al-Malik al-Nasir, he sent a formal request to enter Egyptian lands. A gesture of respect, the Sultan, intrigued, granted it. The next 3 months would rewrite the city's economy. Mansa Musa set up his vast camp outside the walls. From there he began. His first act was piety and political savvy. He distributed a staggering amount in charity, to the poor, to scholars, to officials. Stories say he gave away so much he created instant millionaires among beggars and clerks. every official he met, from the vizier to the gatekeeper, got a gift that could change a family's fortune for generations. This wasn't just generosity, it was a strategic flood. It put Malian gold directly into the hands of the people who ran Cairo. Then he turned to the markets. Cairo's souks were used to wealth, but never consumption on this scale. His entourage needed supplies, but they also wanted luxuries: silks, spices, manuscripts, fine horses. And they paid for everything in pure gold dust, in crafted nuggets. The merchants were thrilled at first. They raised their prices astronomically, seeing a lifetime opportunity. And Mansa Musa's people paid them without haggling. The gold flowed out of the treasury and into the merchants' tills like water. Imagine a single buyer entering a small town, buying everything in sight with $100 bills. The local economy booms overnight. But what happens when that buyer has an endless supply and the town's supply of goods is limited? The price of everything starts to climb, not just the luxuries but the essentials: bread, cloth, rent, because now every merchant and landlord knew there was a new, almost magical source of currency in the city. This was the initial shockwave. The volume of gold was so vast, so concentrated in one place and time, it began to distort the idea of value. The gold that had been rare in Cairo's markets was suddenly common. And when something becomes common, even if it's gold, its power fades. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage of faith had, at its first major stop, accidentally triggered a local economic crisis. But he was just getting started. The real crash was still to come when this distorted market connected to the wider world. The problem was the amount of gold he brought. Mansa Musa was giving gifts as an act of devotion. But in Cairo, in those markets, those gifts became something else, a kind of economic weapon he never meant to use. He gave away gold. Historians put the number between 12 and 18 tons of pure gold just during his stay there. To think about that scale, a single modern dump truck, if you filled it completely with gold bars, that's about 1 ton. So picture 12 of those trucks, or 18. All of that gold emptied into the city's economy, and this happened over just 3 months. It was a tidal wave of wealth, hitting one unprepared shore, and that triggers a basic rule, a law of economics. It was true then, it's true now. When the supply of something goes up dramatically and the demand stays the same, its value falls. Gold was the currency. It was the foundation of value across that whole region. And Mansa Musa, by being so generous, he made gold common in Cairo. Suddenly, every merchant he'd gifted, every official, every beggar, they all had pockets full of it. The market was flooded. The immediate effect was this surreal prosperity, but it was an illusion, because as gold lost its rarity, its purchasing power collapsed. A merchant who used to sell a bolt of fine silk for 1 gold coin, he now saw that coin as less valuable, so he raised his price. He might ask for 2 coins. Or 3. This wasn't greed, it was an adjustment, a direct response. The gold in your hand just wasn't worth what it was yesterday. That's price inflation in its purest form. And it didn't stop at silk, it didn't stop at spices. The rising prices rippled out to everything: the cost of bread, the cost of grain, renting a room, hiring a laborer. All of it began to climb, and for the everyday people in Cairo, the ones who hadn't received Musa's direct charity, life got harder. Their savings, maybe a few gold coins put away for a wedding or an emergency, those coins were now worth a fraction of what they'd been. Their ability to buy what they needed just evaporated. Even the Sultan's own treasury, filled with gold, was suddenly less powerful. In domestic trade, in foreign trade, a local economic crisis had begun. Not through malice, but through an overwhelming act of piety, one that ignored the delicate balance of a market. The gold arrived as a blessing, but it turned into a curse for the city that hosted him. And that localized shock, that was just the first tremor before the quake spread. The financial chaos was happening, but Mansa Musa was building something else. Cairo's markets were reeling from all that gold. Meanwhile, the emperor himself was engaged in a different kind of exchange, a quieter one, more deliberate. He had an audience with the Sultan, al-Malik al-Nasir. It was a diplomatic triumph. Court chroniclers wrote about his humility, his deep religious knowledge. It commanded respect from a ruler used to displays of power. Here was a sovereign from a distant, mysterious land, speaking with the grace of a seasoned scholar. That was the real message he'd come to deliver. Mali wasn't just a primitive kingdom of treasure. It was a sophisticated empire of faith and learning. His engagements went beyond formal courtesies. He sought out the brightest minds in Cairo, had long discussions about law, astronomy, philosophy. He didn't just listen. He recruited. One of the most significant figures he convinced to return with him was a poet and architect, Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. That decision left a permanent mark on West Africa. Al-Sahili is credited with introducing the Sudano-Sahelian architectural style in Mali. Those iconic structures, the Great Mosque of Timbuktu, towering minarets built from sun-baked earth and timber. Sweeping, organic forms that seem to rise from the soil. That architectural legacy, which defines the region to this day, was a direct result of this exchange. Mansa Musa also hired Arab secretaries, legal scholars, teachers. He purchased countless manuscripts on medicine, mathematics, loading camels with knowledge as precious as gold. His goal was clear. He was importing intellectual capital, building the infrastructure of a learned society back home, using his wealth not just to dazzle but to develop. This shows the duality of his pilgrimage. One hand was distributing gold with such abandon it destabilized economies. The other was carefully gathering seeds. Seeds of culture, science, governance to plant in his own empire. The economic shock was an unintended side effect, overwhelming, but the cultural mission was entirely deliberate. It shows a ruler whose vision went beyond wealth. He wanted to weave Mali into the fabric of the Islamic world, not as a distant source of gold, as a respected center of civilization. The crashing gold markets made headlines for centuries, but the libraries, the universities, the architectural wonders he fostered, that was the legacy he intended to build. The caravan moved on from Cairo, but the economic shock didn't stay behind. It traveled with them, right there with the remaining gold. Their route turned east across the Sinai Peninsula. That harsh, biblical landscape, a dry corridor between continents, then into the Hejaz, the mountains of Western Arabia where the holy cities are. Every settlement along that ancient pilgrim road saw it. From Aqaba on the coast to the wells inland, each place had a smaller version of what happened in Cairo. The pattern repeated. A local economy built for a steady trickle of pilgrims suddenly faced a deluge. Mansa Musa's people needed supplies, water, animal fodder, food. They paid for everything in gold, and he gave alms as he always did to the poor and the religious in each town. These weren't global hubs like Cairo. Their markets were smaller, more fragile. Pumping that much precious metal into a closed system, the distortion was even greater. A merchant in some desert town might see his entire year's business happen in one afternoon, paid for with gold that had, months earlier in Egypt, already started to lose its shine. The devaluation was spreading town by town like a slow stain. Then they reached Mecca. Their spiritual journey culminated right in the Hajj season itself. The city was a swirling, sacred metropolis. Pilgrims from every corner of the Islamic world, from Spain and Morocco, from Persia and Anatolia, from the trading ports of India, all converging in one place, and into this global gathering walked the Emperor of Mali, with his retinue of thousands. His arrival was more than a personal milestone. It was a strategic announcement on the world's biggest stage. For those tens of thousands of pilgrims, Mali changed. It went from a whispered legend, a rumor of distant gold to a tangible, overwhelming reality. They saw the scale of his caravan. They heard the stories firsthand now, stories of his piety, his staggering wealth, from people who had traveled with him or met him on the road. They witnessed the respect he commanded. In that holy city where faith momentarily flattened social hierarchies, Mansa Musa performed the same rituals as every other pilgrim. But the context of his presence was unmistakable. He was placing his empire vividly and permanently onto the mental map of the entire Muslim world. A pilgrim from Granada, a scholar from Baghdad, they went home with a new understanding. West Africa wasn't a periphery, it was a power, and its ruler had just walked among them. That cultural and diplomatic victory was absolute, yet the very tool he used to achieve it, the relentless distribution of gold, was quietly undermining the economic foundations of the regions he'd passed through. The pilgrimage was a triumph of soft power, but its financial aftershocks were only starting to reverberate back along the trade routes toward the commercial centers he'd just left behind. The spiritual journey was done, but the financial part, that was just starting. In 1325, Mansa Musa turned the caravan south, back toward Mali. The mood was different now. That triumphant procession entering Egypt was a depleted force. The treasury was a shadow. Tons of gold had been given as alms, spent on supplies, traded for silks and manuscripts. What was left was probably just enough to get home, not enough for another spectacle. For the first time, the emperor of the world's richest gold supply faced a cash flow problem. He went back through Cairo, the city he had dazzled and destabilized months before. Now it showed him a new reality. He needed funds to pay his remaining people to provision the desert crossing. So he was forced to go to the merchants, the same Cairo merchants who had grown fat on his earlier spending. He asked to borrow money, and they charged him interest. A high rate. Historians say he may have had to pay back nearly double what he borrowed. Think about that. He was borrowing Egyptian gold dinars, currency made from or backed by the very gold he had flooded into their market. Gold that was now less valuable because of him. He was buying back his own oversupply, but at a premium, a closed loop. His act of overwhelming generosity had devalued the commodity. Now the market's correction forced him to participate in its recovery. By taking on debt, by creating a sudden demand for liquid capital, he helped slowly soak up the excess gold. He was no longer a supplier, he was a buyer, and his need helped nudge prices back toward stability. This personal scramble had broader implications. His borrowing showed that even the source of the flood wasn't immune. It showed how interconnected these medieval economies were. A spending spree in Cairo could force a loan in Cairo, which then influenced lending rates and gold valuations back along the trade networks to Alexandria and beyond. The ruler who had bent the market with his wealth was now being bent by the market's own rules, a humbling lesson in economic gravity. What goes up must come down. Even an emperor has to pay the price. His pilgrimage was an act of faith that accidentally became an economic experiment, and on the return trip he was living through the results. Mansa Musa's caravan disappeared south into the desert, but the economic ripples he created, they lasted. We know that from a scholar who showed up in Cairo a full decade later. Shihab al-Umari, an Arab historian, a diplomat from Damascus, he traveled to Egypt in the 1330s, and he found a marketplace still talking about that pilgrimage. Al-Umari was meticulous. He interviewed officials, merchants, scholars, people who'd been there. What he recorded was a market in a long, slow recovery. The price of gold, he wrote, stayed low. It was struggling to climb back. The volume Musa brought in, it was like a weight on the economy, a weight that took more than a decade to lift. He quotes one source with a telling phrase, "This is the reason for the cheapness of gold in Egypt to this day." That phrase, "to this day," that's crucial. It means this wasn't a brief spike, not a week of chaos. This was a sustained condition. a depression in the value of the medieval world's most important commodity. Traceable to one man's journey, Umari's testimony changes the story. It moves it from legend into a documented event with measurable consequences. It gives us a timeline. The gold market didn't bounce back quickly. Recovery was a process, probably took years for that excess gold to be absorbed, to be reminted or traded wider or hoarded away. That primary source is our anchor. It confirms the pilgrimage was more than a spectacle. It was an economic shockwave, and its echoes were still being felt long after the last camel had crossed the Sahara. So that's what it meant for Cairo's markets. But the world beyond that, how far did the tremor actually travel? Cairo's market was the center, but the shock traveled. Egypt wasn't isolated. It was a giant heart in the medieval world system, a main artery connecting two networks. To the south, the gold routes from Mali, from deeper Africa. To the north, the Mediterranean lanes, dominated by the Italian republics, Venice and Genoa. Their whole business model, their rise, was built on moving luxury goods east to west, and they relied on a stable medium, gold that flowed through Cairo. When that gold's value fell in Egypt, it didn't stay there, it rippled across the sea. Think of a merchant in Venice. He's financed a shipment of spices from Alexandria. He expects to sell those spices for a certain number of gold florins. His profit, his ability to repay investors, his next voyage, all calculated on the stable value of those coins. Then the news arrives. A flood of new gold from Africa has hit Cairo. The purchasing power of a gold dinar there has dropped, and the calculations unravel. The spices might be worth the same, but the gold he's paid in might now be worth less. His expected profit shrinks, maybe it vanishes. For the bankers who funded him, this is a crisis. Their loans are backed by future gold receipts that are now less valuable. That delicate chain of credit, the one that fueled Mediterranean commerce, it began to tremble. That's the connection. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage didn't just crash a local gold market. It sent a tremor through the financial architecture of Europe's rising powers. The Italian city-states were the venture capitalists of their day. Their wealth came from managing risk across distance. And here was a new, unpredictable risk. A sovereign from a continent they barely understood could, with one act of devotion, upend the value of the currency underpinning their trade. It forced a recalibration, a new wariness about the source of their wealth. It made the world feel larger and more fragile. That recalibration challenges an old idea. The notion that medieval Africa was closed off, disconnected. This event proves the opposite. An emperor's journey from West Africa didn't just reach the Mediterranean world. It financially shook it. His actions altered loan terms in Genoa. They influenced profit margins in Venice. They showed unmistakably that Africa was not a passive recipient of history. It was an active generator, a continent whose internal decisions could send economic shockwaves across oceans and deserts, linking the fate of Saharan caravans to the ledgers of European merchants. This was a single, spectacular proof of a deep and ancient interconnection. The pilgrimage was finished, but the work was just starting. Mansa Musa came back to Mali, and he had these new ideas. A clear vision for what the empire could be. The gold markets over there in the Mediterranean, they were still recovering, but he looked inward to the cities in his own kingdom. The gold that was left after the journey and the loans, it wasn't going to just sit there. He would put it into the ground, into stone and earth and wood. To build something that would last, he wanted to change the capital, Niamey, and Timbuktu, which was already important. He wanted them to be world-class. To show the empire's real stature, this wasn't just about beauty, it was about a legacy, something that would outlive any shift in the economy. He'd seen Cairo. He'd seen Mecca, and he wanted that same grandeur, that intellectual weight for West Africa, so he called on the most valuable things he brought back. The architects, the scholars, one of them was Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, a poet and designer from Granada. He became central. Al-Sahili, he's the one credited with bringing a new architectural language to the region, refining it, a style suited to the climate, to the materials of the Sahel. It's called Sudano-Sahelian. It used mud bricks, sun-baked, adobe, and these wooden beams that stuck out from the walls. Toron, those beams, they weren't just decoration. They were permanent scaffolding. For the replastering you had to do every year after the rains, the result was architecture that looked like it grew from the earth. Towering minarets that tapered, smooth, sweeping walls. The most famous project was the Jingraba Mosque in Timbuktu. Mansa Musa commissioned it, funded it directly when he returned. Al-Sahili had a key role in the design. That mosque became the heart of the city, not just a place for prayer, an anchor for the community, for the university next to it, Sankor. Its construction meant a new era. Timbuktu wasn't just a trading post at the edge of the desert anymore. It was becoming a sacred city, a city of knowledge. The building boom went beyond that. Palaces went up, libraries, other mosques in Naini, in Gao. This huge investment in infrastructure, it did more than change the skyline. It changed destinies. It created jobs for thousands of craftsmen, laborers, artists. It attracted scholars from across Africa, from the Middle East. They came to teach, to study in these new institutions. The cities had this new energy, a mix of commercial wealth and intellectual pursuit. That gold, the one that caused so much disruption abroad, it was being converted at home. Converted into walls that gave shade, into spaces for debate, into a cultural capital that would draw people for centuries. The economic chaos in Egypt, it faded after about a decade. But these physical structures, these centers of learning, they became his real monument, his lasting one. They stand as a reminder that the most volatile wealth, if you have a vision for it, can be forged into something that endures. The story of his journey didn't just stay in Timbuktu. It moved on paper, in stories, across the sea, into the workshops of Europe. In 1375, a master cartographer on the island of Majorca, Abraham Cresques, was commissioned to make a new kind of map. The Catalan Atlas, a lavish, multi-panel work meant as a gift for a king, one of the most detailed pictures of the known world at that time. And there, in the section for Africa, was this image. A ruler seated on a golden throne, in one hand a gleaming orb, a massive gold nugget. An inscription beside him reads, "The richest and noblest king in all the land." That was Mansa Musa. More than 50 years after his pilgrimage, the memory of it was so powerful, so defining. It became how European mapmakers saw a whole continent. Cresques had never been to Mali. He used traveler accounts, merchant stories, legends that had circulated for decades, and the central legend was the Gold King from the south. This atlas wasn't just for navigation. It was a political document, a snapshot of global power from the Mediterranean view, putting Mansa Musa that prominently. The map acknowledged Mali not as some vague territory, but as a sovereign state. A center of wealth and authority that deserved a royal portrait. That image became Europe's definitive picture of Africa for centuries. For scholars, for princes, for anyone who studied that map, Africa was symbolized by this figure. Serene, overwhelming wealth, the pilgrimage had done its ultimate diplomatic work. It had broadcast the empire's stature to audiences far beyond the Islamic world, cementing Mali's place in the global imagination. The economic shockwaves he caused eventually settled, but this cultural imprint, this proof of his renown, was etched permanently onto the world map. That map made the legend, but legends grow. Over centuries, the story of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage gathered layers. Some tales say he paved the whole road from Mali to Cairo with solid gold bricks. Others claim his spending caused a permanent collapse in gold's value. These are powerful images, but they belong to myth. The truth is astonishing enough without that. So what really happened? The core event is documented: the Caravan, the staggering charity in Cairo, the devaluation of gold, the decade-long recovery. These facts come from sources like Umari. The economic shock was severe. It was real, but it was a market correction, not an apocalypse. Gold didn't become worthless forever. The sudden influx created a glut, and like any glut, it took time for the system to absorb it. Think of a lake after a historic rainfall. The water rises, flooding the shores. But eventually, through streams and evaporation, the lake finds its balance again. The markets in Egypt did that. They adjusted. New coins were minted. The gold was traded further afield. Over about a decade, its value stabilized. The impact was temporary, but profoundly disruptive while it lasted. So why the myths? The Golden Road, the permanent ruin, they serve a purpose. They turn a complex economic event into a simpler parable. The Golden Road speaks to a fascination with ultimate, careless wealth. It makes Mansa Musa a figure who could literally walk on gold. The tale of permanent inflation is a cautionary symbol. It illustrates the danger of concentrating too much wealth in one place. A warning about fragile systems faced with overwhelming force. These legends were shaped by how cultures remembered him. In West African oral traditions, he's the wise, pious ruler who brought glory and learning to Mali. In European and Middle Eastern accounts, filtered through awe, he became almost exclusively the Gold King. His image simplified into a symbol of Africa's fabled riches. A trope that would later be exploited. The myths tell us less about the man and more about the needs of the storytellers. They reveal a world trying to comprehend a power it could scarcely measure. Separating the legend from the ledger doesn't diminish the story. It clarifies its true significance. He wasn't a magical being who broke economics forever. He was a strategic ruler. His real actions briefly bent the global economy to his will, a legacy far more substantial than any golden pavement. The gold that changed everything started out small. It wasn't mined from deep underground by slaves. That's a picture from other places. Mali's gold came from water, from the Senegal River, the Niger River. From the streams in Bambuk and Bure, this was alluvial gold, tiny flakes and pieces worn off rock upstream, then carried by the water and left in the riverbanks. Getting it out was a community effort. Miners, often from specific families, would pan for it. They used simple tools, gourds, woven baskets, shallow wooden bowls. They'd swirl the sand and water, the lighter stuff washing away, leaving the heavy gold behind. It was careful work, seasonal work, following the rivers. This whole scattered system was the empire's economy. Mali's brilliance wasn't owning every bit of gold in the dirt. It was controlling the movement. The empire held the trade routes, the markets where the gold was collected. They taxed every ounce heading north to the Sahara. They offered safety, stability, a reliable currency. That made traders want to bring their gold to Mali. It was like a toll road for the most valuable thing in the world. The miners and merchants were independent. The government was the road and the bank. This created huge wealth without Mali having to do the hard work of mining itself. It was efficient. It made Mansa Musa incredibly wealthy. But this setup had a weakness. The wealth depended on a constant, heavy flow. The goldfields weren't endless. Panning a river only works as long as there's gold to find. Over time, the best, easiest spots could run thin. The empire's power was built on taxing a stream that might someday weaken. That dependence on a finite resource became a quiet problem for the future. After the peak of Mansa Musa's time, that golden stream gradually tightening would be a challenge that taxes couldn't fix. The caravan's real engine was people. 60,000 souls moving together across a continent. We talk about the wealth, the spectacle, but without that human force, the story is hollow. A force with many faces, each playing a role in this moving city. The soldiers were the caravan's armor, a professional guard, thousands of them. Their job was immense: protect the emperor, yes, but also protect the treasury from bandits on the desert routes. Maintain order within the camp itself. They were the enforcers of Musa's peace, making sure the column didn't fracture under the Sahara sun. Their presence was a statement. Sovereign power visible to every tribe and kingdom they passed. Then the administrators, the clerks, the quartermasters, the judges. Think of the logistics. Feeding that many people for a year, distributing water in the desert, settling disputes over lost camels or traded goods. This was a government on the move. They turned a royal whim into a daily, functioning reality. Without their silent work, the caravan would have collapsed under its own weight before it ever reached the Nile. Islamic scholars provided the spiritual compass. They led prayers in the desert camps. They advised Musa on religious protocol as he entered foreign lands. They were also diplomats of faith, engaging in discussions with clerics in Cairo and Mecca, showcasing the depth of Mali's Islamic learning. They were the keepers of the pilgrimage's purpose, making sure it remained an act of devotion. Artisans traveled too, blacksmiths to repair tools and weapons, leather workers for saddles and waterskins, tailors and weavers. They were the maintenance crew for a miniature civilization. Their skills turned the camps from temporary shelters into organized, functioning spaces, even in the middle of nowhere. And then there were the enslaved individuals. To ignore this is to sanitize history. The practice was a grim reality of the era across many societies. Mali was no exception. Enslaved people were a form of mobile capital, a display of wealth and labor. They performed the most grueling tasks, setting up and breaking down camp, tending to animals, carrying loads. Their experience of the pilgrimage was fundamentally different. They saw the same wonders, the pyramids, the Kaaba, but not as pilgrims. They were there as instruments of another's devotion. Their personal stories, their hardships, are almost entirely lost. We have no record of their names or their thoughts. Yet their labor was the unseen foundation the spectacle was built on. To understand the caravan's full impact, you have to hold both truths: the dazzling achievement of its organization and the human cost embedded within it. This immense, varied mass of humanity is what stunned Cairo. It wasn't just a rich king arriving. It was an entire society with all its structures and hierarchies appearing at the gates. The soldiers projected might, the scholars projected wisdom. The sheer scale of the support staff projected unimaginable organizational power. Every person in that caravan, from the highest general to the most burdened servant, was a brushstroke in the portrait Musa painted for the world. A portrait of an empire that was not merely wealthy but complete. His pilgrimage was a spiritual duty, but the way he carried it out, that was a diplomatic move. Every gesture a piece of statecraft, every gift calculated. He entered Cairo not just as a pilgrim, he arrived as the head of a major power. His charity wasn't random. It was a targeted investment. He enriched scholars, officials. He bought their goodwill. He created a network across Egypt, people who now had a personal stake in seeing Mali favorably. That soft power, using wealth to shape perception, to build alliances without a sword. His audience with the Sultan, al-Malik al-Nasir, was the centerpiece. The chroniclers noted his humility, his deep knowledge, but that humility was a posture. It disarmed rivals. It presented him not as a barbaric king from a land of gold, but as a pious, learned peer. A sophisticated peer. That performance let him negotiate from overwhelming strength while appearing as a respectful guest. He was securing Mali's place in the Islamic diplomatic community, ensuring safe passage for his merchants, establishing formal recognition to make trade smoother. In Mecca, the audience was broader. The Hajj gathered the entire Islamic Ummah, the global community. By performing the rites alongside pilgrims from every corner of the world, he embedded Mali into that collective consciousness. he was no longer a distant rumor. He was a fellow believer and an emperor. The stories those pilgrims carried home reshaped maps. They reshaped merchant ledgers from Granada to Delhi. This was nation branding on a medieval, intercontinental scale. The recruitment drive was strategic too. The scholars, architects, secretaries he brought back weren't trophies. They were vital human capital. He was importing the administrative expertise to run a complex empire, the artistic knowledge to build enduring monuments. By attracting these professionals, he accelerated Mali's development, making it a true rival to the historic centers of learning in the Middle East and North Africa. So the pilgrimage served three state objectives. It elevated Mali's international stature, it aimed to lock in favorable economic terms, and it launched a massive program of intellectual and cultural development at home. The gold was the medium, but the message was about legitimacy, power, and legacy. He crashed the gold economy. We use those words now: crash, inflation. They fit, but this wasn't Wall Street, medieval Egypt. There were no central banks, no tickers. Value was something you could hold: sacks of grain, bolts of cloth. The weight of metal in your hand, but the forces, they were the same: supply and demand, scarcity and abundance. His pilgrimage, it created a supply shock. That's the term, a sudden, massive increase in the supply of a critical thing. And here, that thing was the money itself. It was gold. Think of a single ship. It sails into port, unloads a year's worth of grain all at once. The local price of grain, it would just collapse. The market flooded. Now, replace that grain with gold. And replace that one ship with an emperor's caravan, carrying what might have been years of the entire region's normal gold supply. That's the scale. The mechanism was simple, brutal in its logic. Gold's value came from its rarity, from how hard it was to get. When Mansa Musa made it common in Cairo, even for a little while, that rarity just vanished. A gold coin wouldn't buy what it used to. Its purchasing power fell, and that hit anyone whose wealth was in gold coins. Savings eroded. Contracts written in gold terms, they became unfair. Wages paid in gold bought less bread. The people who benefited, they were the ones with physical goods to sell. They could raise their prices, and the ones who got his direct charity. But for everyone else, it was like a silent tax, a reduction in their economic security they never saw coming. That's why it's important to historians. It's a rare case, a clear one, like a laboratory example: monetary inflation in the pre-modern world. We can see the cause, the concentrated influx of currency. And we have the effect, documented a decade later by Umari, the long depression in gold's value. It proves that even then, in a non-capitalist economy, these basic rules applied. If you dramatically increase the money supply, and there's no corresponding increase in goods, prices rise, value falls. So the story isn't just about legendary wealth. It's a textbook illustration, written in gold dust across the 14th century. That pilgrimage was a peak, a summit, and from there the only way was down. Mansa Musa died around 1337, and his death, it ended an era, that era of a single, overwhelming vision. His son took the throne, Mansa Musa I. But no one who came after could match him. Not in stature, not in authority, not in that sheer force of personality. The empire he left was magnificent. But it was also stretched. The spending on the Hajj, that masterstroke of diplomacy, it had drawn deep on the royal reserves. That gold wasn't infinite. It flowed out, and it didn't all flow back. The challenges came from inside and out. Inside, you had disputes over succession, over regional power. That centralized control Musa held so tight, it started to fray. Local governors, distant relatives, they saw opportunities, and to hold a territory that vast, from the southern forests to the northern desert towns, that took constant investment. Constant presence, a line of strong leaders, unbroken, that got harder to sustain. Outside, the world kept moving. New powers were rising. To the east, the Songhai. Centered on Gao, they'd been part of Mali, but they grew restless. They built their own strength, and the trade routes, Mali's lifeblood, they began to shift. European ships started coming down the coast, looking for direct access to gold, to goods. That was a slow process over centuries, but it meant bypassing the old trans-Saharan caravans. The networks Mali had mastered, the networks they taxed, the empire's great strength, its control of the desert crossroads, it became less central to everything. So the decline, it wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a slow fading, a loss of that concentrated influence, the influence Musa had projected onto the world. Later rulers faced rebellions. They saw provinces break away. They struggled to manage an economy without that bottomless well of gold, the well that defined Musa's reign. The pilgrimage, looking back, it was that brilliant, fleeting moment, the apex. It proved the empire could bend global economics to its will, but it was also a performance. One that could never be repeated. After Musa, the empire never had that combination again. The immense wealth, the unified leadership, the audacity to project it all across continents. The gold markets recovered, the maps were redrawn, and Mali settled into a long transition from a world-altering superpower into a kingdom, still respected but no longer dominant. Its legacy was secure, but its moment, that moment of overwhelming, disruptive influence that had passed. History has these rulers always on the move. These grand processions meant to awe people, to dominate. Like the Roman triumph, a general comes back to Rome, parading through the streets with all the treasure he captured, the prisoners he enslaved. It's this ritual, just pure military power. Or the Chinese emperors with their elaborate tours. They'd move the whole imperial court across the countryside, inspecting frontiers, demonstrating this celestial mandate. These were displays of sovereignty. They were meant to reinforce order inside a realm. Mansa Musa's journey has that surface quality. It was a magnificent spectacle, all this wealth and authority. But the core engine was different fundamentally. His wasn't a victory lap after some conquest. It wasn't an administrative inspection. It was, first and last, an act of personal faith. The Hajj was the center, non-negotiable. Everything else, the diplomacy, the economic chaos, that was a secondary effect. However massive it was, that distinction is what makes his pilgrimage unique. In the whole historical record, it was a private religious obligation that accidentally functioned as the most potent piece of statecraft of its age. Economic, cultural, the Roman general displayed loot he had taken. Mansa Musa distributed wealth he already owned. The Chinese emperor moved his court to govern. Mansa Musa moved his court to pray. The unintended consequences of his devotion, that's what echoes through time. No other royal journey wove those threads together so seamlessly. Piety, politics, and pure market force, and then pulled on one thread so hard it unraveled the fabric of distant economies. That blend is his signature. His singular one. The pilgrimage was the cause, the crashed gold market. That was the spectacular result, completely unplanned. His journey echoes beyond the 14th century. We still hear it now. That core dynamic from Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, one actor with concentrated resources, disrupting a whole system, it plays out in modern markets constantly. Take a major government. It decides to release its strategic petroleum reserve onto the world market. That sudden, massive influx of oil is meant to lower prices, to give some relief. And it does work for a while, but it also sends shockwaves through futures contracts, through investment plans, through national budgets. It's a deliberate version of the gold flood. Using a stockpile to bend a market on purpose, or you see it in the art world. A billionaire collector makes a record purchase at auction, pays hundreds of millions for one painting. That does more than just buy a masterpiece. It resets the value for that artist's entire work for a whole movement. It distorts a niche market, makes it inaccessible to almost everyone. It influences what galleries show, what museums can even afford. That's concentrated wealth acting as a force, reshaping a system through one spectacular transaction. So Mansa Musa's story is really about scale and equilibrium. It shows the power that comes from controlling a critical resource, whether that resource is gold or oil or data or even attention. His pilgrimage was the ultimate display of that power, a performance that met its diplomatic and spiritual goals perfectly, but it's also a warning about unintended consequences. When symbolic gestures, however grand, however well-intentioned, when they collide with intricate, interconnected networks, the results can be chaotic. They can be far-reaching. The systems we build for stability and exchange are resilient, but they aren't immune to overwhelming force. His journey reminds us that even acts of faith, statements of identity, when they're backed by staggering concentration, they can't be separated from their economic weight. They ripple outward, they change lives and markets in ways the actor might never see coming. So the final measure of such a man, it isn't just the chaos he caused. It's the world he left behind. For a long time, Mansa Musa was just a curiosity, a story about a king with unbelievable wealth. In a lot of Western history, Africa below the Sahara was a blank space. A place with no history before Europeans arrived, a continent just waiting to be found. But the records from Mali's empire, its administration, its schools, its trade routes, they directly challenge that. They're not myths, they're evidence, the same kind of evidence you'd use for any complex society. Tax documents, building plans, letters between states, reports from travelers. Mali left a paper trail, written by its own people and by visitors from across the Muslim world, and that archive shows a real, sophisticated state. It shows deliberate economic policy. It shows deep connections to global networks. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage wasn't some isolated event. It came from a system that could organize a trip lasting a year, that could handle high-level diplomacy, that could mobilize resources on a scale that destabilized economies far away. Looking at this event fixes a major omission. It takes us past stereotypes of simple tribes or passive riches. It makes us see medieval Africa not as the outskirts, but as a central participant, a series of powerful, innovative civilizations. They were architects of their own fate. They were major players on a global stage. Mali under Mansa Musa wasn't a strange exception. It was a high point of a pattern. You see it in Ghana before it. You see it in Songhai and Benin after. These were states with laws, with specialized jobs, with their own money and international trade deals. Acknowledging this does more than just fill in details. It changes our basic understanding of how the medieval world functioned. It shows the movement of ideas, goods, and power was never just one way from Europe and Asia out. It was a complex web, and African empires were crucial, active points in that web. They weren't just suppliers of raw materials, they were buyers of luxury items. They were supporters of art and learning. They exported cultural and intellectual influence. The gold that flooded and crashed the market in Cairo came from a society capable of that exact kind of disruption. And that fact by itself changes Africa's historical role from a passive object to an active, formidable subject, a continent where internal decisions could send waves across oceans and deserts, changing the course of economies, redrawing what was possible for everyone else. The gold dust is gone now, lost to time, but the earth remembers. In Mali and the countries around it, archaeologists are working. They're digging through layers of soil, looking for the physical echo of that golden age. They want to move the story out of old books into the real world of stone and clay. Into foundation lines. This is slow work, verification. finding the empire not in its wealth but in its everyday life. At Naini, the traditional capital, they've found the outlines of a city. A real urban center, not a temporary camp, a planned city. They've uncovered foundations of large buildings, multi-room structures. These could have been administrative offices. Royal quarters, they find pieces of imported glass, glazed ceramics from North Africa, fine local pottery. Every shard is a clue. It points to a society connected to far-off trade. A society with a taste for refinement, the means to get it. This was a place of governance where decisions were made, decisions that sent a caravan across a desert. In Gao, the great eastern city, digs have gone deeper. They found a cemetery, memorial stones with Arabic inscriptions. The names and dates in the stone match the timeline of Mali's dominance. These aren't just graves, they're permanent statements, statements of identity and faith, left by a settled, literate elite. This confirms it. A sophisticated Islamic community was here. Integrated into the empire, exactly as the old accounts say. Then there's Timbuktu, the city of scholars. Here, archaeology works with the monuments that are still standing. But under the great mosques, studies of the foundations support the histories. They show phases of construction, expansion. This corresponds with the era of Mansa Musa's return. His investment, the very earth under the Jingraba Mosque, holds evidence of the building campaign he launched. Beyond the monuments, they find writing boards. In quells, fragments of manuscripts in residential areas. This paints a picture, a city where literacy and learning were part of daily life, not confined to a library. This material evidence does something. It turns legend into lived experience. A piece of Chinese porcelain found in a Gao market layer. It's not just a rare object. It's proof of a merchant's journey, a consumer's choice, a cultural exchange that spanned half the globe, a locally minted copper coin worn smooth from use. It tells of a standardized economy operating inside the empire's borders. These artifacts are the quiet counterpoint to the spectacular story of the pilgrimage. They speak of stability, routine, a civilization building for the long term. Every discovery helps rebalance the record. For centuries, the main narratives came from outsiders. Arab geographers, European mapmakers, their accounts are invaluable, but they were filtered through awe, sometimes misunderstanding. The physical evidence from the ground is a corrective. It's an internal record, written in the language of architecture and artifact. It lets the empire speak for itself, in the things it built, the things it used, the things it left behind. This slow assembly of fragments, it's more than academic. It's a reclamation, piecing together a history of grandeur from the soil. Offering a tangible link, a link to the world that produced a king who could, for a moment, hold the global economy in his hand. The soil has its record. The air has a different one. For centuries in West Africa, the story of Mansa Musa hasn't been kept in books. It's been kept in song. It lives with the Griots. The historians, the poets, their art is the living archive of that whole region. And when a Griot performs, it's not just listing facts, it's invoking a lineage. It's connecting now to a foundational past. In that repertoire, Mansa Musa has a place of honor. He's remembered not for crashing gold markets, he's remembered for his character. The Griots praise his wisdom, his unwavering sense of justice, his deep, guiding piety. In these performances, the historical emperor merges with the archetype. The ideal king, he becomes a model, a standard. That's what other rulers get measured against. This oral tradition is a crucial counterpoint to the economic chronicles from Cairo. The Arab sources fixate on the spectacle, the weight of the gold. They give us the external view, the shockwave other civilizations felt, but the Griot songs give the internal view. They tell us what his reign meant to his own people, how he was seen from within the culture he led. Here, he's less the disruptor of foreign economies. He's more the builder of domestic peace. There are stories of him sitting under a great tree, listening to the grievances of the humblest subject. They speak of his fairness in settling disputes, his generosity that flowed first to the needy inside his own empire. His pilgrimage is recounted, but it's often framed as the ultimate proof of his devotion. Not as a geopolitical maneuver, the gold becomes a secondary detail, just a tool in the service of his faith and his duty. This cultural memory, passed down generation to generation, it does something. It balances the ledger. It adds the dimension of legacy to the narrative of event. While historians analyze the economic impact of 1324, the Griots safeguard the meaning of Mansa Musa's reign. They preserve him as a cultural hero, a figure who embodied the highest ideals of leadership for his society. This isn't a contradiction of the historical record. It's a deepening of it. It reminds you that a ruler's true impact is measured in more than markets. It's measured in the values he exemplifies, the stories he inspires. The model of governance he leaves etched into a people's collective memory. The gold flowed out, it was spent, but this legacy, sung under the stars for hundreds of years, became a different kind of currency. One of identity and aspiration. The final measure of a ruler is in the echoes. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage stands as one of those stunning convergences in history. A thread woven from faith and sovereign power and raw economics. It achieved exactly what he meant it to. It showed the pinnacle of West African civilization to a skeptical world. He broadcast Mali's sophistication, its wealth, its deep commitment to knowledge and spiritual duty, and in that he succeeded. His image on the Catalan atlas is proof. His name in the chronicles of Cairo and Damascus is proof. But the journey also revealed something he never meant to show. It demonstrated inadvertently the profound fragility of those interconnected medieval economies. A system built on the careful scarcity of gold could be upended by one man's abundance. For over a decade, from the markets of Egypt to the trading houses of Italy, the world felt the tremor of his passage. A real-time lesson in supply and demand, written in gold dust across a continent. That unintended consequence teaches a timeless truth about concentrated wealth. When it moves, it doesn't just change hands, it can change the rules for everyone. And then there's the legacy, the part that outlasted the market correction. He reshaped cities. He funded the mosques and universities that made Timbuktu a beacon for centuries. He reshaped world maps, literally placing West Africa in the global imagination. His story, passed down by griots and geographers, became more than history. It became a parable about the scale of human ambition. So what are we left with? Not just a tale of a rich king. It's a multifaceted lens. Through it, you see the agency of a great African empire. You see the delicate webs that connected the medieval world. And you see how a story, when it's grand enough, can bridge the gap between ledger books and legend.